The pick struck bone. Men froze with muscles tensed around wooden handles, the sound sharp enough to stop conversation. A rib, pale and thin, slid from the loosened earth and rested on damp clay like a small, bitter truth. Shame coagulated in Elias' heart's chest before he had time to name it. The feeling pressed his ribs and made his hands go still. Elias leaned down and touched the exposed bone with the pad of a finger. He had been foreman on small lines for 24 years. He kept a pocket watch and a ledger of who worked when. He knew schedules, tides of labor, and the cost of delaying pay. Now he counted another thing. How a single discovery could break a payroll, a town's patience, and his own record with the company. Noise moved along the cutting as men brushed soil from their boots and circled the pit. Jonas stepped back and set his pick upright, eyes wide. "We stop here, Jonas, we will not put iron over the dead." His voice came out short and sharp. A man laughed once, a brittle sound. Others looked to Elias. The immediate problem was simple and terrible: bones in the line of the ballast. The larger problem sat behind it, whether men would work beneath orders that buried people again. Elias felt doubt at the core of that night. Doubt pinched each choice he could make and drove him forward to speak. "Hold fast, Elias." His voice was low and rough from years in wind and coal smoke. He put his hands on his hips and turned slowly so the lamplight hit the scar on his cheek. "Leave tools where they are. Light the lanterns. Nobody digs deeper until we know what we face." The lanterns sputtered. Men arranged them around the shallow pit. Paper glowed and shadows leaned against the banks. A young laborer pressed a palm over his mouth and muttered a prayer he did not finish. The air carried the smell of damp earth and cold iron. No one moved for several long breaths. Jonas jabbed a finger at the pit. "These are coffins' bones. They lie there proper, and you want to scrape them up." His jaw worked. He kept repeating the single sentence as if the sound might keep him safe. Elias turned to Jonas. "Jonas, calm yourself. You know none of that yet. We take a tally and wait." Jonas spat in reply. "Tally won't bring them back. You tell me which one pays the widow. Which one pays the mother who lost a babe in that pit?" The men murmured. The tension shifted from discovery to accusation. That shift, from curiosity to anger, came like a gust across the cutting. Elias felt the anger in the men as a force he could neither ignore nor permit to rule the night. A company lantern bobbed at the edge of the site. Footsteps approached in measured rhythm. An inspector stepped beneath canvas of the foreman tent and unfolded a written order with a dry, flat voice. He wore a clean coat and a collar that did not bear coal. "The line must be completed on schedule, Hart," he said. "Excuses will not move the timetable." Orders from above arrived and tightened the problem into an ultimatum. Elias read the lines the inspector placed on the table. The inspector did not look at the pit or at the bone. He tapped the paper and said, "You will proceed. You will not interfere with progress. The company will not accept delay." Elias felt a second emotion slide under the shame: fear. Not for his life, but for the men under his charge. He imagined the men without wages, with empty cupboards and children who would go hungry. He imagined his name in the ledger of those who had delayed work and lost their positions. The fear made his voice flat when he answered, "Inspector, we found remains. We need to confirm their origin." Elias broke off because two men at the tent flap shouted, "He will not do his duty." One barked, "He will make us lay rails on bones." The inspector folded his arms. "Duty is to the schedule, Hart. Take your men, move on." Outside the tent, Anna Muir came down the muddy lane holding a small parcel wrapped in oilcloth. She had walked from the rows of terraced houses, the shawl tucked tight against the damp. She stopped where the lamplight spilled into the road and called Elias's name in a voice that did not carry alarm but carried memory. "Elias? Anna?" And the word hung between the men like a small, urgent demand. People quieted and turned. Elias noticed the way her hands tightened around the parcel. He saw the threadbare shawl and the locket at her throat. He had watched Anna move through the street for years, quick with bread for neighbors, slow with names of those taken by winter chills. She stepped closer and placed both hands on the tent's folded flap. This ground was used by the parish for paupers' burials last winter. Anna. She did not appeal to law or to company records. She spoke of faces. Mrs. Gawthorne laid her boy there. "My neighbor's 2 children were taken in the fever. They are in that pit, Elias. You remember the fever bell. A murmur passed through the workers. Faces that had been set for labor relaxed into recognition. Men exchanged short sentences. Mrs. Gawthorne, fever season, children. The crowd pulled the situation away from the abstract and into specific names and events. The emotional charge shifted again, from anger at the company to protective grief for known neighbors. Elias felt the shift. He pictured Mrs. Gawthorne's stooped shoulders and Jonas's grandmother who had taken in stray boys during lean months. He also felt the ledger in his breast pocket, the weight of pay records and promises. A neighbor, Thomas Bale, stepped forward, rubbing his palms. He brought a smudged book from under his arm and opened it on the lamplit step of a doorway. The parish ledger's ink had run in places, but entries were clear. Dates, names, a note for burials in the field beyond the back lane. Anna pointed to a line with a finger that trembled slightly. Look here, Anna, March 20th. Burials for fever victims. They came from unmarked graves. The field was known to the parish. Elias read the page. The ink named 5 laborers and 2 children. He had walked past the lane when those names were given out. Each name put a face into the pit. The ledger changed the argument from myth to evidence. Where earlier the company insisted on progress, this book brought responsibility into the circle of lamps. The inspector's jaw tightened. He flattened his palms on the table and snapped. Documents are not my concern. Orders are orders. Men will lay track tomorrow. Jonas stepped forward. Orders. Orders don't carry bones in their pockets, Mr. Inspector. Orders do not feed a widow when wages stop. He spat words fast and hard, each one a pebble thrown. A short argument erupted. Elias had to pull voices into a pattern. He ordered tasks, counted men, moved hands where fists threatened. Stand down. Stand down, he said. The command cut through several lines and bought a few more breaths. Anna watched with quiet intensity. She did not shout. She moved from one worker to another, touching sleeves, naming the buried neighbors aloud. Her tone nudged memory into action. Men who had been ready to strike tools now lowered their eyes and, in several cases, went to look at the ledger themselves. The ledger produced its own shift. Blame moved away from nameless history and toward the company that had allowed housing and burials to be neglected. That night, in the foreman tent, Elias sat with the inspector and 2 company clerks. The lantern threw a hard circle of light on the table. The inspector repeated the order. Elias held his watch and turned the chain through his fingers. He felt another movement inside him, resignation. The shame had not left. The fear remained. Now resignation settled like a used coat. If we stop, Elias slowly, men will lose wages. Families will go without bread. The company will not pay for idle men. We can argue about burial ground when someone pays the town's debts. For now, what do you propose? The clerk answered with a document and a shrug. We do not move graves, we build over them. It reduces cost and keeps the line straight. It will be covered and the rails will hold. Elias, you mean leave them under the track? Exactly, the clerk said, as has been done elsewhere. There is precedent. Keep the schedule. His voice was small but precise. Elias looked out the tent flap at the men clustered beneath lamplight. He saw Jonas with a hand pressed to his mouth. He saw Thomas Bale holding the ledger as if it were a talisman. He thought of Anna's locket and the names inked in the parish book. He heard a man behind him say, "You will be the one who tells them no. You will lose the crew." Elias answered, "I am responsible for those men. I cannot have them leave at the worst hour." His voice lost a fight with the logic of the ledger and the inspector's paper. Then he added in a softer tone, "Jonas, I will not forget this." Jonas looked up. "Do not forget what, Elias? Who is buried there, Elias?" The words landed plain and small. He felt his chest tighten and his hands begin to tremble. The tremor came from a place that had moved through doubt and fear and now sat heavy with obligation. The next morning, under a pale, washed sky, the crew began to lower iron across the shallow pit. Men labored with deliberate care. The spikes struck wood and the sleepers settled. No one attempted to dig deeper. Workers set rails directly over the disturbed earth, as if the iron could make a boundary where respect had been refused. On the embankment, Jonas kept close to Elias. He did not take a tool. Instead, he watched every iron plate set, counting each spike. Every time a spike drove home, his jaw clenched. He spoke once, without looking away from the laying track. "Elias, you told me you will not forget." "Name them then." Say who lies below, Elias answered without moving his hands. Mrs. Gawthorne's boy, Thomas Eld's eldest, Mary Cole's infant. I will say their names. I will carry them in my watch, Jonas. Anna waited until the sun rounded toward noon and then slipped down a narrow lane to the track edge. She carried a small wooden token and a bit of ribbon. She placed the token where the rails met the disturbed earth and did not call attention. A few townspeople saw her and later whispered that she had knelt and touched the soil with the same hands that had once mended shirts for a dead neighbor. That afternoon the inspector walked the finished stretch and made notes in his book. He watched men tie off ropes and tidy ballast. He did not speak to Anna. He did not remove the token. He did ask Elias one final question. Will this stop trouble on the line? Elias put his hand on his pocket watch and looked at the inspector. It will keep trains moving. It will not put bread on every table. It will not mend what was buried, the inspector nodded. His reply was not an answer but a closing of paper. Then we proceed. Weeks later the rails hummed with traffic. A morning train smelled of coal and steam as it passed through on schedule. Elias stood at the embankment and checked his pocket watch habitually. He felt the weight of the ledger and the taste of decisions in his mouth. The emotion at his root had moved again. Shame had given way to a hard, private acceptance. He made small compensations where he could. He arranged for bread to be left at Mrs. Gawthorne's door using his own wages. He visited the ledger and copied a page into his notebook so names would not be forgotten. Anna kept a candle burning in her front parlor window on nights when trains passed close. She did not parade grief. She held the candle low so only a neighbor could see the light. When a child asked why the candle shone, Anna simply said, "So someone remembers tonight." The answer was concrete and quiet. At the edge of the track Elias sometimes paused with the pocket watch in hand. He watched carriages slide by and listened to the metallic ring of wheels on rails. He kept the names in a small folded paper in his coat. He did not speak of them at the company office. One evening, as a train rolled through and lights blinked past, Jonas found Elias on the embankment. "You kept your watch, Jonas." Elias closed his fist around the watch chain. "I keep it because I measure things. I measure time and I measure who goes hungry, Jonas, nothing else." He bent and scraped a small token into the soil beside the rail. The action was quiet and sufficient. The chapter closes on small, concrete acts. Rails ran true and trains kept their schedules. Anna's candle stood at the glass like a small, steady hand. Elias tightened his coat and glanced once at the ledger's names folded in his pocket. He rubbed his temple the way he always did when a choice sat cold and sharp. The night train sighed past and the metal sang under wheels. Jonas crouched, hands on the cold earth, pressing the token into the ground as if to hold what the rails chose to cover. The decision had been made. The town kept a quiet, private record of who lay beneath the iron. The final sound was the distant clack of the train and the soft, steady thud of Elias's watch against his palm as he walked back toward the foreman's tent. A laborer swung a spade and metal rang against a thin, pale curve that should not have been under a work site. Bones spilled from damp clay in a shallow heap. Men froze with shovels still in their hands. Shame caught at Elias's heart before he finished the first breath. It left his mouth hard and tight and pushed his fingers to the pocket where his watch sat. The timetable waited beyond the cutting. Wages waited at the end of the week. Those were the concrete pressures that filled the morning air and set the problem plainly. Complete the line on schedule or stop work for an uncertain delay. Elias stepped down into the pit and crouched with his palms on the earth. He looked at the rib, then at the crew. His jaw worked. He did not speak at once. In the tent above, the company engineer had already put his hands on a roll of paper and a pencil. The engineer kept looking at the sheets and then back at the bones, as if both were items to be checked off. Elias felt shame again, the kind that made his neck hot and his voice small. That shame shaped his first decision. Call the foreman, tell the men to cover the pit, keep the pace. He ordered gravel. Men passed spades and barrows without questions. The first emotion shift came when doubt tightened Elias's chest. He watched the laborer who had unearthed the bones, a youth with a bandaged thumb, hide his hands inside his coat and avoid the pit. Doubt moved Elias to walk the line again, fingers trailing on the packed edge of the cutting, seeking a reason to delay. He found only a timetable nailed to a beam. the arrival time of an engine and a company stamp that promised fines for lateness. The paperwork was a weight on one side of the scale. The thin bones were a weight on the other. "Alias," said Tom Grady, the head ganja, voice low. "We cover and lay, we don't stop." Tom Elias answered, "We need to mark it, we need—" He stopped, his watch caught the weak lamplight. He did not finish the sentence because the company engineer, Mr. Ridley, stepped down into the cutting then, cuffs clean, boots scuffed only at the heel. Ridley tapped the timetable with a pencil. "We have contracts, Ridley. We do not hold up the line for relics." Ridley spoke with the plain authority of paper and signatures. The crew made no sound. The second emotion shift arrived as Elias felt resignation slide into his shoulders. He rubbed his temple with a cold, dark hand and looked at the men who had families waiting for wages. The voices of the men were not abstractions. They were the cough of a child, the rent due at the grocer's, the neighbor's need for coal. Elias listened to that small, concrete list and felt resolve harden in him. He could not gamble their wages on a dispute with the company. A row of barrows scooped damp gravel and began to hide the bones. The action moved like a machine. Shovelful by shovelful, men tamping earth, the rhythm staccato and practical. In the makeshift office tent, Elias found the inspector, a thin man with pale fingers and an even thinner patience. He laid a hand flat on the table where contracts lay and folded his mouth into a line. "You press on," the inspector said. "No delays. We note incidents. You keep the men on the job." Elias nothing at first. He met the inspector's eyes, then turned his face away to hide the line of his jaw. He could have spoken of names and graves. He could have argued that digging up bones demanded inquiry. Instead, he thought of Tom's wife and of the boy who had no other work. Elias moved his hands, a visible calculation. He for an extra day of pay for the men if they moved faster now. He for more lamp oil. He left with no formal permission to halt work, and the inspector's nod stayed precisely within the edge of a promise. When Anna Muir came down the lane, she crossed the worksite as if slipping into a room that already had grief in it. She carried a small satchel and the threadbare shawl she always wrapped tighter in evening drafts. Anna had heard about the find from a passerby. She walked with a careful gait, palms folded around the strap of her satchel. Her arrival introduced the town's memory into the decision in a concrete way. "Elias, Anna," voice low so the crew at the edge of the cutting could not eavesdrop. "Those are people. You must not cover them as if they are rubble." Anna folded her hands around a tin cup and rocked gently on her heels. She spoke of names she remembered, Mrs. Calder's boy, a family that had once lived behind the tannery, small, precise recollections that put faces, not abstractions, into the soil. She did not demand violence. She demanded recognition. Her presence shifted the atmosphere. Men who had been moving methodically slowed their shoveling for a handful of breaths. Elias held the cup for a moment at his chest and let the heat of the metal press into his palms. He did not answer with a long speech. "Anna, I know." He did not say he would stop. He did not say he would go against Ridley. He closed his mouth and stared at the line where gravel met clay. A laborer knelt in the softened dirt and with shaking fingers pried at a small corroded object. He rose and handed Elias a locket rimmed with verdigris. The third emotion shift struck then. Sorrow uncoiled through the crew like a sudden gust. The locket made the remains particular. It made an anonymous heap a household loss. Anna took the locket with fingers that trembled and opened it on the palm of her hand. Inside was a faded photograph the size of a coin. A man in a plain jacket and a young girl with a ribbon at her throat. Anna pressed the image to her breast as if to confirm it was real. The man's name, Calder, and the sound of it moved others. A woman at the work line wiped her face, and a boy turned away. The discovery had changed the argument from theory to fact. It added a human ledger to the ledger of timetables. Elias felt his spine tighten and then loosen in quick succession. He thought of the magistrate and fines. He thought of Tom's wife's ledger at home where she crossed off every bill. He thought of Anna's voice when she said Calder's name. The crew expected direction. Elias could stall. He could write a letter. He could demand an inquest. He started toward the tent to find the inspector again, but Tom caught his sleeve. "Elias, Tom, if we stop, some men go hungry this week." There were 3 swift lines of argument between Elias and Tom, each under 15 words. "We owe them burial. We owe our families bread." There may be more bones, back and forth like that. Elias listened. He felt the pressure that came from the inspector's tolly and from Ridley's ledger against the new weight of the locket. He took the crew's view into account. He felt the shift from shame to duty to a tight professional obedience. When the magistrate and a company foreman arrived that evening, they carried authority like a blunt instrument. The magistrate was a man in a dark overcoat, and he spoke of law in measured sentences. Ridley stood beside him and tapped the timetable again. The foreman carried a ledger and an implicit threat. Delay meant fines. Fines meant that the company might cut men from payroll or end contracts. "You will resume," the magistrate said. "You will clear and proceed. We will note the incident, but the line must stand." Elias, the foreman, added, "We cannot have uncertainty on this grade. The trains will run if we say they run." Elias felt the choice contract into a single, visible decision point. He understood that the magistrate's presence made refusal not only a company problem, but a legal one. He also understood that refusal would place families in immediate danger of lost income. He inhaled and tasted the iron dust on the air. He thought of the locket, of Anna's hands, of the photograph pressed to a palm like proof of life ceased. A fourth emotion shift arrived then, subtle but present. Elias's resolve narrowed into a pragmatic calculation. He walked the length of the cutting. He set his jaw and squared his shoulders. He looked at every man and measured their hunger against the unknown consequences of delay. He spoke plainly. "All right, Elias. We bed the sleepers and lay the rails over the patched pit. We mark the place. We bury with care where we can. We will hold a vigil tonight." The crew exchanged looks. Some nodded quickly. Others did not. Anna's chin lifted the smallest degree. Her fingers closed on the locket so tight that the metal pressed into skin. She one short question. "Elias, will you tell them who is buried?" Elias turned his head toward the men around him. "I'll tell whoever asks. But I cannot risk the men." The argument between Anna and Elias was brief and direct. It had the texture of people trying to do right on two divergent scales. Elias, "Anna, covering them is erasing them. It is hiding them from the town." Elias answered, "I am keeping my crew fed." There were 3 more quick exchanges, a short negotiation layered into the night, and then the work resumed. The climax of action arrived as men lowered heavy sleepers into soft earth and tumbled ballast over the patch. The company foreman watched the measured placements of oak and iron like a man watching balance on a ledger. The engine timetable hummed in the foreman's head and in Ridley's. The actual physical act of laying rail atop human remains had an immediacy that did not allow for abstractions. Men pressed timbers, hammered spikes, adjusted plates. The most intense visual moment was brief and specific. A rail fell into place with a dull, metallic thud that echoed along the cutting. A handful of bones shifted under the new weight and made a dry sound. Elias halted for a breath. He set his palms on a sleeper and felt the faint give beneath his hands, a tiny and terrible confirmation. He kept the work moving. He gave the nod that sent men back to their tasks. This was the chapter's moral peak and the single point where institutional urgency overruled remembrance. The immediate consequence was not dramatic in loud ways. There was no public outcry at once, no sudden collapse. What happened next was small and human. Anna wrapped the locket in oilcloth, tucked it into her satchel, and walked to the narrow footpath that ran beside the finished track. She placed a single candle in the crook of the iron fence that separated Village Lane from the line. The candle's flame was brief and steady against engine lamps and lanterns. Elias checked the men, counted heads, and sent a pair to fetch fresh tea. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the rails stretching away into the dark. He felt a heavy, persistent ache behind his sternum that would not be called by a single word, but which made his shoulders stoop and his voice small when he spoke. He had made a decision that night. He had weighed wages and a town's grief and chosen the track. After a silent hour, the engine did not arrive. Ridley wrote in a small book and closed it as if that would close the matter. The crew broke their tools and slouched toward their lodgings with clothes stiff with dust. In the houses nearby, people murmured at doorways and kept wary watch along the lane. Anna stayed by the fence with the candle until the flame burned low. At one point, a woman called from a doorstep, "Did you see the photograph?" "Yes," Anna replied. "Calder. I knew him." That exchange made the loss precise for others in the lane. A man came forward carrying a sack of coal and laid it by the fence. He stood for a moment and then left without saying more. The small acts of remembrance gathered like a thread. A coal sack, a tin cup left empty, a whispered name. A mid-chapter cliffhanger appeared when a child from the edge of the village ran up the lane with a scrap of paper. He thrust it at Elias and panted 2 words, a list. The paper held the return of names that matched the photograph. It suggested that the pit might hold more than one family record. Elias read the list by lantern and found several familiar surnames. The discovery changed the scale of the problem. It suggested that the patch might be part of a larger burial ground. The question of whether the company had covered only one grave or a long, quiet cemetery shifted the moral stakes. Elias felt his hands go cold. He had laid rails. He had made a choice without knowing the full scope. At dawn, Elias visited the magistrate's tent with the list. He for time to call a proper inquest now that the paper suggested a broader site. The magistrate's reply was a measured refusal wrapped in legalism. "We will note the list," he said. "You will proceed. Any further claims must be filed at the courthouse." That answer hardened Elias's sense of being enclosed by forces stronger than a single foreman or an inspector. He felt trapped between law and livelihood. He called Tom and assigned him to supervise further surveys quietly while Elias promised Anna a minimal acknowledgement. He arranged a small marker to be placed at the footpath where Anna had left the candle. It would be crude and private, a wooden post with the locket's oilcloth tied to it. He did not speak of formal reburial. He did not tell Ridley. Anna accepted the marker with a look that was neither satisfaction nor surrender. She ran her thumb along the oilcloth and then slipped the locket back into her satchel. "I will keep this safe. Elias, I will speak their names at the chapel tomorrow." He meant it with a practicality. A few names read aloud might satisfy neighbors and allow work to continue. Anna's face moved. She breathed once and then let it pass. The chapter wound down around small, ordinary movements: tools cleaned, boots mended, a neighbor bringing soup. Each act registered as a human response to the decision. Some were small atonements, others practical supports that would carry families through a week. Before dawn the next day, Elias returned to the track with his coat buttoned tight. He stood where the rail met the new sleeper and felt the cool of iron through his palm. He called the men together and read aloud the names from the scrap found by the child, audible and slow so that everyone would hear. He pronounced 3 or 4 names that mattered: Calder, Bunn, and 1 others. Hearing their names spoken in the open changed nothing about the rails, but it did change the town's relation to the place. People nodded and some wept. Anna held the locket in her hand, and when Elias finished she stepped forward and placed the oilcloth at the base of the crude marker. She touched the post with an open hand, then stood back. The final paragraph of the chapter is a concrete beat, not reflection. Anna struck a match, held the flame to the thin wick of her candle, and set it at the post beside the line. She did not look at Elias when she did it. She looked down the track where the rails vanished into smoke and the distant shape of an engine. Elias watched the flame and then turned away to check the men, his shoulders square and his hands empty. The candle guttered but stayed lit as the morning fog thinned and the first cart passed over the new rail with a dull, steady rattle. Elias hammered the final spike and felt something brittle give under his boot. A pale sliver of bone rolled from the ballast and struck the wood with a dull click. Shame named itself in Elias's chest before his mouth could form words. He swallowed, tasted grit, and set the hammer down with a hand that did not stop shaking. The platform filled with conversation and the scrape of feet, but the noise narrowed for him to the sound of that click. The pick had struck bone earlier, men had frozen with handles spread in their palms, and now the discovery lay exposed for every eye at the inauguration. Voices lifted around him. A company engineer cleared his throat and spoke of schedules and fittings. The town magistrate smiled with papers in hand. Elias felt his shame shift into something colder. Duty. He had orders, wages to protect, men who looked to him for steady hands. Shame turned into doubt, and doubt turned into a hard pressure on his jaw as officials stepped forward to clasp hands and claim the line as completed. Anna Muir moved through the crowd with a thin step and a note of something concrete behind her eyes: memory, obligation. The stubborn care of someone who had held mourning tokens in her palm. She had watched the men uncover bones over the last days. She had wrapped a small token in cloth and kept it, a plain thing with a child's scratched initials that would not leave her. When she reached the platform, she did not shout. She stopped, placed her hand on the rail, and said, "You tell me there will be passengers on this line today. Whose graves do you ride over, Mr. Hart?" Her voice was low but clear. The question cut into the assembly like the sound of iron against stone. Elias looked at Anna. He could hear the magistrate moving to intervene, the engineer's jaw tightening. The crowd tracked his face. He could refuse, explain, delay. He could sign the completion and give the men their wages. Shame again, then a shift into resolve. His first thought was for the workers, for the men who trusted his decisions to feed families. He stepped forward and answered, "We found remains. I told the company. They me to continue. I told them I wished otherwise." He did not sound triumphant. He sounded small and practical, like a man listing facts to keep a difficult ledger balanced. The company engineer, a narrow man named Cartwright, came up with a folder. "Elias Hart," he said. "The line must open on schedule. Delays cost the company, and the town has contracts. We have offered compensation. There are procedures. You will sign the certification when I ask." His voice carried the practiced calm of paperwork and ledger books. Anna answered him with a single, deliberate line. "You offered coin while bones lay in the soil. That is not the same as honoring the dead." A murmur went through the crowd. Magistrate Webb folded his hands and said, "Mrs. Muir, Mr. Hart, this is not the place for full debate." His posture was meant to close a conversation. Anna stepped closer, and her eyes went to the exposed patch of ballast near Elias's boot, where a shard of cloth still clung to dirt. "The cloth is recent," she said. "Someone wrapped these people not long ago." The word recent shifted the assembly's attention. Faces that had been placid now tightened. For a moment the air counted its options in the sound of boots and the rustle of coats. Elias felt fear pulse under the resolve. Fear moved his fingers to his pocket where the small watch lay heavy. He could order the crews to stop. He could back the men who had been working under his command. Or he could let the timetable hold. The crowd's eyes were stakes into his chest. He walked down the short slope to the exposed patch and crouched, more to keep his hands steady than to study the bones. He touched the earth where the cloth showed through and found the bottom of the grave as shallow as a threshold. He remembered the pick striking bone in the fields a fortnight ago and the way the men had stood frozen, cleansed by the blunt fact of it. That memory lodged, practical and clear, and pushed him toward a decision. Anna did not wait for him. She lifted the folded cloth with 2 fingers and opened it to reveal a small, smeared wooden toy with initials carved into the side. She held it up so Elias and Cartwright and the magistrate could see. "This child lived within memory," she said, "not some distant past. We buried within living memory." Her voice carried the weight of a neighbor who had held vigil. Conversations broke into question and accusation. A worker in a coal-stained cap shouted, "We signed papers. We set rails. What do you want from us, Anna?" His voice was edged with anger and fear. The exchange turned talk into a small clash. Hands went toward pockets and boots scraped gravel. Elias had taught his men to be steady with spikes. He now steadied himself by giving orders no one wanted. "Pull the men back," he said to the foreman nearest him. "Cover the opening. Stop the trains until we sort this." His voice had the flatness of a man balancing payroll. Cartwright's face thinned. "Hart, you cannot stop the certification without a company directive. We will not accept liability. The town will lose contracts. The shareholders will." He did not finish because Magistrate Webb stepped between them, hand raised. "We will convene a council. We will hear statements. For now, keep the peace." Webb's words were meant to lock the day into procedure. Anna turned and said, "A council that does not look at evidence is not a council at all." Her hands folded around the toy until the wood creaked. The engineer and magistrate exchanged a look that was equal parts calculation and annoyance. That evening, in the embankment shadow near the track, Elias found Anna waiting by a pile of spoil. The sky had gone dull and the lamps along the line leaked a yellow softness. The mood shifted again in Elias. Shame to doubt, to responsibility, to the tiny, stubborn flicker of protectiveness. "Elias," Anna without preface, "the token you held the other day. Do you remember the rib that came loose at the field? There was a name in the dirt. Someone near here has lost more than a generation. She unfolded a scrap she had kept. A burial tag with a name and a date within the last few months. This is not a long, closed grave. Elias closed his eyes, felt the watch against his palm. He heard the hammer strikes still in his memory. I remember the pick-struck bone, he said. He named the earlier event plainly, the fact anchoring the conversation. Anna's breathing tightened. Then you know this cannot be ignored. You know what it means for the families. Her hands went to the satchel at her side. I found a list of names in a ledger by the parish. People complaining of fever. They buried on the field when there was no space left. She spoke with the steady rhythm of someone delivering facts to a ledger. She wanted him to see the arithmetic of loss. They did not argue then with force. They counted consequences aloud. If I refuse to certify, Elias, the men will wait. They will go unpaid. The company will replace me or push me aside. Perhaps they'll bring in others willing to do the job regardless. His voice was a register of reality. Anna's fingers tightened on the satchel strap. If you sign, they bury people again under rails. You will carry that. Shame returned as an H along his ribs. He pressed a thumb to the thin scar on his left cheek, the one the foreman had given him years before in another scrape over men and wages. The next day a worker turned over ballast and exposed a cluster of shallow graves. Cloth, string, the imprint of folded hands in the clay. A child's keepsake lay half buried and sodden. The discovery changed the argument from claim to evidence in the open air. Cartwright insisted on sealing the site and continuing. Burials like these are an inconvenience, Mr. Hart, but they are not a legal bar. We will re-enter if necessary, with a note of compensation. The line will not be delayed beyond the trial. His tone assumed the language of mitigation. Anna called out the names she had found in the ledger and the crowd listened. A woman in the front, hair streaked with grey and soot, put her hand to her mouth and said, "My sister, she was buried in August." There was no space in the yard. We took her behind the mill. The crowd shifted. A simple statement made private loss public, and the air between men and officials changed weight. That exchange forced Magistrate Webb to propose a late council, a meeting in the town chamber that same evening. The council was meant to be calm. It was not. In the town hall, Cartwright offered coin and quiet deals. He placed a sheet on the table and began to read lines about compensation for families and expedited work on a promised diversion. Elias watched his hands. He felt the pressure of the room push against his ribs. Anna read a list aloud of those buried with names and dates. She did not beg. She made a ledger of people and places and loss. We will not be bought with coin without graves being acknowledged, she said. We ask just that the dead be moved with care and named in the record. Cartwright's mouth tightened. Webb attempted to broker a compromise. The debate tightened. Workers in the back shifted their weight and muttered about missed wages and the difficulty of long waits. They want to keep the men paid, Elias quietly to Anna. They will sign papers and someone else will lay the rails if I refuse. The facts simply. Anna answered with a line that made him flinch. Then you must choose who you serve, Elias Hart. The men who trust you, or a ledger that keeps its feet dry. Her voice made a choice visible. At that hour, in the hush after the meeting, a small group of neighbors gathered at Anna's door. They planned a simple sabotage. Loosen spikes, pile ballast, make the line unsafe for a trial run. Their hands moved in the dark with purpose. They counted the number of spikes needed and the shifts when the workmen would be gone. Anna stood steady as they whispered. Elias could have stopped them. He did not. His emotions shifted again, responsibility bending into complicity, and then into a calculated risk. He knew the danger Anna took. He also understood why she did not trust the company to comply. The sabotage happened at midnight under lantern light. Anna and 3 neighbors worked fast to pull spikes and heap ballast where a trial train would pass. Elias watched from a short distance, hands in his pockets, listening to the creak of the rails and the small curses of men who found the track disturbed. Company men discovered the interference before the trial began. A scuffle followed, hands grabbed, voices rose. Cartwright's assistants argued with townsfolk about trespass and law. A worker named Tom Keene, whom Elias had fed and sheltered during a bad winter, stood between the sides and said, "This is not stealing, Mr. Cartwright. This is stopping the desecration of our dead. Keen's voice carried the bluntness of someone who had known both hunger and the sight of buried hands in the soil. The confrontation grew heated in short, clipped exchanges. "Put the men back to work," Cartwright barked. "Call the watch, Webb." "No watch will carry a train across graves while I breathe," Anna snapped. In the struggle, a lantern fell. Sparks made a small comet against the ballast. For a breath the night was noise and light. Then someone pushed a lantern aside and it rolled, guttered, and went out. That motion left a sudden cliff-hanger. Would the trial proceed? Would the company call soldiers? Would a train run on unsettled sleepers? At 2 in the morning the company announced a trial run despite the disturbance, saying they had patched the line and could secure a safe test. Men went to bed with uneasy sleep. Elias did not go home. He stood on the embankment as lanterns bobbed along the track and thunder of a distant engine grew. He had moved through shame, duty, fear, and into a narrowed clarity. He could not allow a train to pass over graves that might collapse under weight. The trial run approached like a machine of inevitability. When the engine light came, Anna and a handful of neighbors lay ballast in key spots to force instability, hoping to slow the train without causing damage. The engine came, sounded its low note, and the line leaned. The disturbed earth beneath the newly laid sleepers gave a quarter cry of settling. The ground shifted where a shallow grave had been compromised. Sleepers shifted with a wet snap. The engine's wheels kissed the rails with a grinding urgency. Elia saw the gap open under the sleepers and the loose earth sliding like wet cloth toward the sleepers' ends. He ran forward. He did not shout. He threw himself between the engine crew and the controls and pushed the driver back from the whistle. Hands grabbed at him. He demanded the levers be held. "Stop. Stop the engine," he said, voice hard and breathless. The driver, a broad man with soot on his face, heard the raw command and slackened. The engine did not slam brakes so much as be cajoled into a cautious stop by men who now had to choose between law and life. A section of sleepers collapsed into a shallow pit with a sound like old boards falling onto thin bones. Cartwright ran toward the spot and watched as a patch of disturbed earth revealed cloth and the corner of a child's keepsake. He reached down, fingers brushing dirt, and then froze. Anna stood with a lantern balanced in her hand. Her face was pale where lamplight hit it. Elias felt his ribs ache. He was scratched and dirty, and the coil of the watch chain hung from his waist. Workers gathered and held one another's shoulders. Some wept openly, others kept faces hard. The engine crew, asked later, would say they felt two things in that moment: the mechanical judgment of load and the human judgment of men who would not let the machine blunder through human remains. Cartwright cursed quietly about expenses. Magistrate Webb knelt and touched the edge of the cloth as if reading a ledger anew. That touch counted as an action in the public eye. It was no longer only the labor of men and the demand of a company, but a civic moment. Dawn came with a small, thin cold. The town gathered where a haphazard memorial had been arranged, a ring of candles, a pile of found tokens, a child's toy, a few sprigs of pressed grass. Elias sat with his hands over a wound on his forearm, where he had been scratched by a splintered sleeper. He spoke in low sentences with Anna as the crowd milled. "We stopped it," she said. "We made them see it could be stopped." She pressed the small toy into his palm, a transfer of witness. The company conceded to reroute the public trial and to delay the line while proper burials could be made. Cartwright agreed in writing to fund the reinterment and to place a notice of record in the parish books. Magistrate Webb read the notice aloud and signed. The workers received wages for the delay. Some men grumbled, others nodded. Elias watched the signatures being placed on paper. He had risked his place to force this resolution. He had risked his pay and reputation. He had waded through shame and duty and fear and come to a decision shaped by the faces of the town. In the days that followed, the community gathered the remains found along the embankment and the field. Anna organized a list of names matching tokens to ledger entries, and the town clerk recorded each. Men dug with reverent hands. They wrapped bones in cloth and made simple coffins from spare boards. Families placed personal items beside the remains. The act of digging and reburial was not theatrical, it was a sequence of quiet tasks: measuring, shoring, lowering, covering. Workmen who had placed rails now placed planks into graves. The company supplied lumber and hired local diggers on the company's account. The town agreed to a small memorial at the edge of the diverted line. Elias kept to the tasks that were given to anyone who knew ballast and nails. He drove spikes into the coffin's frames and braced shoring. Each motion was an answer to the shame that had sat in his chest. He did not make long speeches. He cut wood, tied cloth, and helped carry. Anna moved among families, naming each token aloud and recording the details in a careful hand. She spoke with neighbors and remembered dates and small facts. Where someone had last been seen, which fever had taken them, who had helped lay them in the shallow earth at dusk. She made a ledger of compassion where bureaucracy had once tried to make the matter into a line item. Before the new line could reopen, the company erected a small plaque and the parish placed a notice. There was no brass band, no grand ceremony. Instead, there was a brief reading by Magistrate Webb and a short, plain prayer at the edge of the burial ground. Those present placed their candles down, and many touched the wood of the coffins with a hand that was both casual and precise. Elias stood at the edge of the crowd and felt the last shift in his emotions. From shame through responsibility to a quiet, resigned clarity, he did not feel absolved. He felt accountable and bound to the men who had labored, and to those whose names had just been spoken aloud. Cartwright's ledger would note the added cost. The shareholders would grumble in rational letters. The line would be delayed but would run eventually where the earth had been reworked and proper graves marked. Elias's foreman would stay with him or go elsewhere. Some left in the weeks after and found work on other lines. Tom Keene took a job repairing wagons. Anna continued to visit the new memorial, adding a sprig to the soil when she could. The town learned to trace names at the parish office. People who had walked the line before glanced at the plaque and lowered their heads for a moment. In the last action of the chapter, as a small crowd dispersed and the candles guttered, Magistrate Webb handed Elias a folded notice and spoke in a low voice. "You signed for the town tonight, Mr. Hart. The council will record what happened. The company will rewrite the trial. There will be work ahead to make sure this does not repeat." Elias took the paper, his fingers stained with dirt and the memory of nails. He folded the watch into his palm and then slipped the paper into his pocket. He walked away from the memorial with Anna at his side. She did not say much. She simply held the list she had compiled and looked at the placard where names had been added within the week. The chapter ends with Elias closing a small ledger, like glance toward the line, and then turning to follow the path back into town with the signed notice in his pocket, the reburied ground behind him, and the engine's distant hum resolved into a careful, slower rhythm.